The exploration vessel Aurora moved slowly through the darkness of space as Captain Jake Morrison watched the screens in front of him with calm eyes. His ship carried 47 humans, and they were about to cross a line that no other species had dared to cross in 3,000 years. The boundary ahead marked the edge of the Dominion, which belonged to the Vraxi Collective, and everyone in the galaxy knew what happened to those who entered their territory without permission. They died, and their entire species was marked for destruction. Jake knew this, and so did every member of his crew, but they kept moving forward anyway because humanity needed this. Space and humanity needed these resources. Lieutenant Sophie Grant sat at her station monitoring the communication systems in the moment they crossed the invisible boundary. Every alarm in the galaxy seemed to go off at once. The Vraxi detection systems had spotted them immediately, and warships were already moving to intercept their position. Sophie looked up at Jake and he gave her a small nod, because they had expected this response and they had prepared for it as best as they could. Commander Chris Palmer stood beside Jake reviewing the tactical information, and his face showed no fear even though the numbers were terrible. 3 Vraxi heavy cruisers were coming toward them, and each one was 10 times the size of the Aurora with weapons that could tear their small ship apart in seconds. Jake asked how long they had before the enemy arrived, and Chris told him 18 minutes, which gave them very little time to prepare. The crew moved quickly to their battle stations, and there was no panic or shouting, because every person on this ship had volunteered for this mission knowing they might never go home again. Lieutenant Danny Cooper worked in the engineering section routing power to their shields and weapons, which were experimental designs that had never been tested in real combat. Ensign Kate Williams prepared the final message that would be sent back to Earth no matter what happened to them in the next hour. When the Vraxi ships arrived, they came with all the confidence of a species that had ruled this part of space for longer than human civilization had existed. Their lead vessel was called the Eternal Fang, and it was so massive that it made the Aurora look like a child's toy. Commander Jaltir led the Vraxi fleet, and he sent a message to the human ship that was short and brutal. He told them they had violated sacred territory and that humanity would be marked for extinction. He offered them 2 choices, which were to surrender and die quickly, or to run and die slowly while being hunted across the stars. Jake listened to the translation of the alien message, and then he looked at Chris, who raised one eyebrow, waiting to see what the captain would decide. Jake told Sophie to send their response, and she transmitted his words with a steady voice that did not shake even a little bit. She told the Vraxi that this was Captain Jake Morrison of the human vessel Aurora, and that humanity was claiming this space as their own. She said their threats meant nothing, and that if the Vraxi wanted them gone, they would have to come and take this territory by force. The bridge went silent after those words were sent because every human present understood what they had just done. They had declared war on an empire that had destroyed countless civilizations, using a single ship that was outgunned in every possible way. The Vraxi response came in the form of weapons fire that lit up space like a dozen suns. Energy beams carved through the darkness and converged on the Aurora's position with perfect accuracy. Danny Cooper pushed their shields to maximum power, and his hands moved so fast they were almost a blur. The ship shook violently as the first impacts hit, but the shields held because human scientists had developed new technology based on principles the older races said were impossible. Danny called out that shields were at 60% and that they could not survive. Another attack like that one. Jake stood, perfectly still, watching the tactical display, and he could see the Vraxi ships moving into an encirclement pattern, which was a standard military formation used to trap weaker opponents. They expected the Aurora to panic and try to run, which would give them an easy kill. Instead, Jake gave an order that made Chris Palmer smile for the first time since the battle began. He told them to launch all the drones at once. The Aurora carried 200 small combat drones, and they poured out of the ship in a silver cloud that moved in random patterns the Vraxi computers could not predict. Each drone was barely larger than a human fist, but packed with cutting-edge technology that humanity had spent decades developing. The drones were too small and too fast for the massive weapons on the Vraxi cruisers to target effectively. They swarmed around the Eternal Fang like angry insects and attached themselves to the hull in specific locations before detonating in a carefully timed sequence. Each explosion was tiny compared to the size of the massive alien warship, but there were 200 of them, and humans had always been very good at finding weak points in their enemies. The drones targeted sensor arrays and weapon mounts and shield generators with surgical precision. Within minutes, the Eternal Fang was blind and bleeding atmosphere from a dozen holes in its armor. Commander Jalter had expected to execute a helpless victim, but instead he found himself in a real fight for the first time in his long military career. Sophie Grant had been working quietly at her station during the chaos, and she suddenly announced that she had broken into the Vraxi communication network. Their ships used quantum-entangled systems that were supposed to be completely unhackable, but Sophie had found a way inside anyway. She started feeding false information into their sensors, which made the Vraxi cruisers chase phantom images, while the real Aurora slipped between them like a ghost. Kate Williams fired their railguns at point-blank range into the engines of the second cruiser, and the kinetic projectiles punched through shields and armor before detonating the fuel reserves. The cruiser exploded in a massive fireball that briefly outshone the nearby star. The remaining Vraxi ships broke their formation in confusion because this was not supposed to happen. Trespassers always died. The Dominion always won. That was the law of the galaxy that had stood unchanged for 3,000 years. Jake watched the chaos with cold calculation, and he knew they could not win a long fight. It was time for the second phase of their plan. He told Sophie to broadcast their message on every frequency that existed. The transmission went out across the entire Dominion and reached every Vraxi world and every species that lived under their control. Jake's words were simple and clear. He said that humanity had crossed into their space and that the Vraxi had tried to destroy them and failed. He said humans were here to stay and would not bow to threats or retreat from bullies. He invited them to come with everything they had so humanity could show them what happened when someone mistook youth for weakness. The message was designed to provoke the Vraxi into responding with overwhelming force, because humanity's real advantage had never been technology or firepower, but rather the ability to turn an enemy's strength into their own weakness. The Aurora jumped to faster than light speed and vanished before the remaining Vraxi cruisers could recover. But Jake knew they would come back with everything they had, and that was exactly what humanity needed them to do. 3 weeks passed after the Aurora's first encounter with the Vraxi, and during that time the alien empire assembled a fleet that would have made any reasonable species surrender immediately. Supreme Commander Rethzar personally took command of 200 warships ranging from small frigates to massive dreadnoughts that carried enough firepower to destroy entire planets. The Vraxi gathered at the edge of what they still believed was their territory, and prepared to make an example that would be remembered across the galaxy for centuries. They jumped into the system where the Aurora had been detected, expecting to find perhaps a small human colony or a few hastily built outposts, but what they discovered made even the most experienced Vraxi commanders stop and stare in disbelief. The system had been completely transformed in just 3 weeks. Hundreds of human ships filled the space, but these were not warships like the Vraxi expected. Instead, they saw construction vessels and mining platforms and habitat modules and transport craft, all working together with incredible speed. Humans had moved into the system with a velocity that seemed impossible to species who took decades to plan a single colony. Jake Morrison now coordinated the defense from a command station built on the largest habitat, and he watched the Vraxi fleet arrive with grim satisfaction. Chris Palmer stood beside him along with a newly arrived military coordinator named Ryan Hughes, who had come from Earth with reinforcements. Ryan observed the tactical display and noted that the Vraxi had brought everything they had. This was not a patrol or a warning, but an extermination fleet designed to wipe out every trace of human presence. Jake replied that this was good because the more ships the Vraxi committed to this battle, the fewer they would have to defend their territory elsewhere. The Vraxi sent their final ultimatum, giving humanity 1 hour to surrender or face complete destruction. Jake's response was to order all construction operations to continue exactly as before, as if the massive alien fleet simply did not exist. Welding torches continued to spark across a dozen hull frames. Mining drones kept working in the asteroid belt with patient efficiency. The message to the Vraxi was crystal clear, because humans were not leaving this system no matter what. Threats were made. When the hour ended, Rethzar gave the order to attack without any more warnings or negotiations. The Vraxi fleet moved forward in perfect military formation, creating a wall of firepower that had never known defeat in 3,000 years of conquest. They opened fire at maximum range, and the amount of destructive energy they released would have been enough to crack open a planet's crust and boil away its oceans. But the human ships did not try to stand and fight. Instead, they scattered in every direction like a school of fish avoiding a predator, and their movements were coordinated by an artificial intelligence network that Sophie Grant had designed based on swarm intelligence principles. No single ship tried to be a hero. They just fled in what looked like panic drawing the Vraxi fleet apart as the aliens chased after what they thought were easy targets. Danny Cooper now served as chief engineer of the defensive network, and he activated the surprise that humanity had spent 3 weeks preparing. The asteroid belt, which the Vraxi had dismissed as completely irrelevant, suddenly came alive with thousands of hidden weapon platforms. Each platform was small and disposable, but together they represented firepower that rivaled the entire Vraxi fleet. The platforms opened fire in perfectly synchronized volleys, targeting the now scattered Vraxi ships with massed kinetic strikes. The Vraxi shields had been designed to stop massive energy weapons like the ones their own ships used, but they proved far less effective against clouds of high-velocity metal slugs that tore through their defenses like paper. Commander Rethazar watched his perfect formation disintegrate and realized far too late that he had fallen into a carefully prepared trap. The humans had not been trying to defend this system in a traditional sense. Instead, they had turned the entire star system into a massive killing field, using the Vraxi's own tactical doctrines against them. Rethazar ordered all ships to execute a tactical withdrawal and reform at the jump point, but the humans were not finished with them yet. Kate Williams now commanded a squadron of fast attack craft, and she led her pilots in strafing runs against the retreating Vraxi vessels. Her orders were not to destroy the enemy ships, but to cripple them by targeting engines and navigation systems. Every damaged ship would slow down the entire fleet's retreat and make them vulnerable to further attacks. The battle continued for 6 brutal hours. Human ships darted in and out of weapons range like mosquitoes biting at a much larger animal. The hidden platforms in the asteroid belt kept firing until their ammunition was exhausted. Vraxi ships exploded or went dead in space with their crews trapped inside damaged hulls. When the fighting finally ended, the Vraxi had lost 43 ships completely destroyed and another 70 so badly damaged they would need months of repairs. Humanity had lost 12 vessels and 372 lives. By any military calculation, it was a stunning victory for the defenders who had been outnumbered and outgunned. At the start of the engagement, Jake Morrison reviewed the casualty reports in his private office, and each name on the list felt like a personal failure. Even though the battle had been won, each human who died had crossed into this dangerous space knowing they might never return home. They had volunteered anyway because they believed in what humanity was trying to accomplish. Ryan Hughes came to see Jake with a communication intercept that Sophie had decoded from captured Vraxi transmissions. The messages showed confusion and disbelief among the alien commanders. They kept asking each other what kind of species would choose to fight when running away was a perfectly good option. They could not understand why humans would risk death when survival was possible. Jake smiled grimly at the question, because it revealed how little the Vraxi understood about humanity. Humans had not come to this region of space to survive. They had come to thrive and to grow and to claim a future that no one else would give them. Running away would mean accepting whatever scraps the older species were willing to share, and humanity had decided that was not good enough. Jake told Ryan that apparently the Vraxi had never met humans before, and now they were learning what that meant. Sophie Grant continued to monitor Vraxi communications in the days after the battle, and she discovered something interesting. The subject species who lived under Vraxi control had also been watching the fight. For 3,000 years, these conquered peoples had believed the Vraxi were invincible and that resistance was impossible. Now they had seen a newcomer species defeat the Vraxi not once but twice using nothing more than courage and clever tactics. Whispers began to spread through the Dominion carried on secret communication channels that the Vraxi could not fully control. The whispers asked dangerous questions about whether the Empire was really as strong as it claimed and whether freedom might be possible after all. The Vraxi leadership understood that they faced a crisis unlike anything in their long history. They had built their empire on fear and the certainty that resistance was futile. Now these strange humans from a distant part of the galaxy had shattered that certainty with 2 unexpected victories. If the Vraxi did not crush humanity completely and permanently, then other species might begin to think that rebellion was possible. The Empire could fracture from within as subject peoples rose up against their masters. This made the human threat existential in a way that went far beyond the loss of territory or ships. Jake Morrison sat in his command center and studied intelligence reports about Vraxi fleet movements. He knew the next attack would be even larger than the last one. The Vraxi would bring everything they had because they could not afford to lose again. Chris Palmer joined him and suggested they should request more reinforcements from Earth, but Jake shook his head. Help from home would take months to arrive, and the Vraxi would attack long before then. Humanity would have to win with whatever forces they already had in the system, plus whatever clever tricks they could invent in the limited time remaining. Danny Cooper proposed building more hidden weapon platforms, but the asteroid belt had been stripped of useful resources during the first battle preparations. Kate Williams suggested training civilian pilots to fly combat missions, but most of the civilians had no military experience at all. Ryan Hughes calculated that even with perfect tactics, humanity could not survive another fleet engagement if the Vraxi brought twice as many ships as last time. Every option seemed inadequate for the threat they faced. Sophie Grant discovered the Vraxi's true intentions when she intercepted a coded transmission from deep in the Dominion. Her face went pale as she read the translation, and she immediately brought it to Jake. The Vraxi were not sending another conventional fleet. Instead, they were deploying something called world breakers, which were massive vessels designed for only one purpose. They existed to destroy planets completely and permanently, turning living worlds into lifeless rocks floating in space. The Vraxi had decided that if they could not defeat humanity in ship-to-ship combat, then they would simply eliminate every world where humans had established colonies. Jake felt ice water flow through his veins as he read the report, because humanity now had 7. The Vraxi Collective convened an emergency council deep within their capital world, and for the first time in living memory, the chamber was filled with genuine fear rather than confident arrogance. Empress Shelvara sat on her throne and listened to her commanders argue about how to deal with the human problem. Some wanted to escalate the conflict by bringing the full military might of the Dominion against the human colonies. Others urged caution and suggested that perhaps these humans were more dangerous than initial assessments had indicated. A few even whispered that maybe negotiation was possible, though. They were quickly silenced by angry glares from their more aggressive colleagues. Shelvara raised one hand and the entire chamber fell silent immediately because no one questioned the Empress when she had made a decision. She announced that they would crush humanity not with another fleet, but with the Armada, and specifically with the World Breakers. A shocked silence filled the room because the World Breakers were the ultimate weapons in the Vraxi arsenal. These massive ships had been designed centuries ago for only one purpose, which was complete planetary annihilation. They had not been deployed in 500 years because no species had been foolish enough to require their use since that time. One advisor found the courage to speak up and suggested carefully that the World Breakers had never been used against a mobile enemy. He noted that they were slow vessels and vulnerable to the kind of hit-and-run tactics that humans seem to favor. Shelvara cut him off with a sharp gesture and said she did not care about tactical concerns. The humans had established 7 colonies in what was rightfully Vraxi territory. She would destroy all 7 worlds and everyone living on them. The galaxy would see what happened to those who dared challenge the Dominion, and no species would ever make that mistake again. 6 months passed while the Vraxi prepared their ultimate weapons, and during that time humanity worked frantically to find some way to defend against the coming threat. Jake Morrison had been promoted to Admiral of all human defensive forces, but the promotion felt hollow because he knew their weapons could not scratch the armor on a world breaker. These vessels were the size of small moons with shields powerful enough to shrug off any attack humanity could possibly mount. Danny Cooper ran simulation after simulation trying to find a weakness, but every scenario ended the same way. The world breakers would reach the colonies. They would fire their terrible weapons. The worlds would burn and hundreds of thousands of people would die screaming. When the 4 world breakers finally arrived, they moved through space with the slow inevitability of a glacier. They did not hurry because nothing in the galaxy could stop them. Chris Palmer stood beside Jake in the command center watching the sensor readings, and his face showed the kind of despair that came from knowing you had failed to protect those under your care. The massive alien vessels would reach New Boston in 3 days. New Boston was a young colony with 40,000 people, including families who had left Earth to build something new and hopeful in this distant region of space. Jake stared at the tactical display for hours trying to see something that everyone else had missed. The world breakers were too massive to destroy. They were too heavily shielded to damage. They moved too slowly to outmaneuver, but their weapons had planetary range, so speed did not matter anyway. Chris finally said what everyone was thinking. There was no way to stop these things. Humanity had fought bravely and won impossible victories, but this time there were no clever tricks left to try. This time they would lose and lose catastrophically. Jake looked up from the display and said quietly that they were not going to stop the world breakers. Chris turned sharply, ready to argue, but Jake continued before he could speak. He said they were not going to stop the alien weapons, but they were going to redirect them. The plan formed in his mind as he spoke, and it was desperate and probably insane. Danny Cooper called it a suicide mission when he heard the details. Sophie Grant ran the calculations and determined they had less than 18% chance of success. But it was the only option that did not end with human colonies burning under alien fire. Ryan Hughes volunteered to lead the operation before Jake could even ask for volunteers. He said he would take 30 ships all equipped with experimental gravity manipulation devices, and they would attempt to create a gravitational corridor in space. If they positioned themselves correctly and generated enough artificial gravity, they might be able to pull the world breakers off course. Not by much, because the alien vessels were so massive, just enough to send them into the system's star instead of toward the colony world. The problem was brutally simple. To generate sufficient gravitational force, the human ships would need to be very close to the world breakers. And the alien vessels, despite their lack of speed, were heavily armed with defensive weapons. Kate Williams insisted on joining the mission, and so did 250 other volunteers, which was far more than the operation required. Jake approved them all, knowing that most would never return home. He shook hands with Ryan before the fleet departed, and neither man said anything, because there were no words adequate for the moment. The operation began as the world breakers entered the target system, moving toward New Boston with inexorable purpose. Ryan's fleet positioned themselves in a carefully calculated pattern, creating an invisible web of artificial gravity that began to bend space itself. The world breakers detected the gravitational interference immediately, and their defensive batteries opened fire. The first human ship to die was a light cruiser called Phoenix. It simply vanished in a flash of light as alien weapons vaporized it completely. Then the Valiant exploded. Then the Defiance. But the surviving ships held their positions, maintaining the gravitational net, even as death rained down around them. Slowly and impossibly, the trajectory of the world breakers began to shift. The change was measured in tiny fractions of a degree, but those fractions would mean everything when calculated across millions of kilometers. Danny Cooper monitored the operation from the main command station, and sweat poured down his face as he watched the numbers. Ship after ship died, holding their position to the last possible second. The gravitational net held even as it was paid for in human lives. Danny whispered that it was working. The world breakers were going to miss the planet. Their course was shifting just enough to send them past New Boston and directly into the embrace of the system's star. But the cost was devastating beyond anything they had experienced before. Of the 30 ships that entered the operation, only 7 survived to the end. Ryan Hughes went down with his vessel, refusing to abandon his post, because every second he maintained the gravitational field increased the chance that the plan would succeed. Kate Williams barely escaped her own doomed ship. The world breakers, unable to correct their massive momentum in time, plunged into the star. 4 of the most powerful weapons ever built by the Vraxi burned up in nuclear fire. They had been destroyed not by superior firepower, but by human determination and the willingness of people to sacrifice everything to save others. Jake Morrison attended the memorial service for the fallen, and his face looked like it had been carved from stone. 283 names were added to the growing list of humans who had died defending the colonies. Each name was read aloud. Each sacrifice was acknowledged. The survivors stood in silent rows, and when the ceremony ended, they went back to their duties because the war was not over. The Vraxi still had 3 more world breakers, and there was no guarantee humanity could stop them if they were deployed again. But something had changed across the Dominion. The subject species, who had been watching these events with growing interest, saw what humanity had done. They saw a young species face annihilation and refuse to submit. They saw humans sacrifice themselves to save their own people. They saw the impossible become possible through courage and determination. The whispers that had started after the first battles became louder conversations. On a dozen worlds, conquered peoples began to meet in secret to discuss whether freedom might be achievable after all. Sophie Grant intercepted communications that showed the Vraxi. Leadership was increasingly worried about internal stability. Several subject species were showing signs of unrest. Supply lines were being disrupted by what the Vraxi dismissed as accidents, but Sophie could see patterns that suggested coordination. Someone was organizing resistance movements across multiple worlds simultaneously. She brought this information to Jake, who studied it with tired eyes. He wondered if humanity had accidentally started something much larger than their own fight for territory. Chris Palmer suggested they should try to make contact with the resistance movements and offer support, but Jake hesitated. Humanity was barely surviving its own war. They did not have resources to spare for other species, no matter how much those peoples deserved freedom. Danny Cooper argued they should focus everything on defense because the Vraxi would surely retaliate for the loss of their world breakers. Kate Williams, who had lost most of her squadron in the Gravity Net operation, said quietly that maybe helping others fight for freedom was exactly what humanity should do. It was who they were. It was why they had crossed into the Dominion in the first place. Jake made his decision. He told Sophie to send a message on. Empress Shelvara stood in her throne room and watched the reports come in from across the Dominion with growing fury that threatened to consume her completely. 17 subject species had risen in open rebellion, and they were using human tactics to strike at the infrastructure that held her empire together. Supply convoys were being ambushed. Communication hubs were being destroyed. Military garrisons were finding themselves cut off and surrounded. The careful order that had ruled for 3,000 years was collapsing, and at the center of it all were these insufferable humans who refused to die when they were supposed to. Her military advisors suggested pulling forces back from the frontier to crush the rebellions, but Shelvara knew that would be seen as weakness. If she withdrew from human territory, then every species in the galaxy would know the Vraxi could be beaten. If she focused on the rebellions, then humanity would expand further into what was rightfully her domain. She was trapped between two impossible choices, and the rage she felt made her want to destroy something with her bare hands. She made a decision that her advisors would later call madness. She would lead a strike force personally to Earth itself. She would bypass the human colonies and cut off the source of resistance at its root. If Earth burned, then humanity would collapse and the rebellions would lose hope. Jake Morrison received intelligence about the Vraxi plan from Sophie, who had become incredibly skilled at intercepting and decoding enemy communications. A fleet of 80 ships led by the Empress herself was moving directly toward Earth. They were not stopping to engage the colonies or the defensive positions humanity had established. They were going straight for humanity's homeworld, betting that its destruction would end the war. Jake felt cold fear settle into his stomach because Earth had some defenses, but nothing that could stop 80 Vraxi warships led by their most experienced commander. He called an emergency meeting with all senior officers and told them the situation. Chris Palmer said they needed to intercept the Vraxi fleet before it reached Earth because fighting in orbit of their homeworld would result in millions of civilian casualties, even if they won. Danny Cooper said they should take every ship they could spare and throw everything they had at stopping the Empress. Kate Williams, who had rebuilt her squadron after the losses at New Boston, volunteered to lead the fighter attack, knowing it would be the most dangerous assignment in the battle. Ryan Hughes had died at New Boston, so Jake himself would have to coordinate the fleet because there was no one else with the experience to do it. Humanity assembled every ship that could fly and fight. Military vessels were joined by armed transports and converted civilian craft. It was not an impressive fleet by Vraxi standards. The ships came from different manufacturers and did not have standardized systems. Some were barely spaceworthy and held together by the determination of their engineering crews. But it was everything humanity had, and everyone who volunteered knew they were fighting for the survival of their species. If they failed, then Earth would burn, and human civilization would be set back centuries if it survived at all. The two fleets met at a point in space that would later be called Earth's threshold. The battle began at maximum range, with both sides launching missiles and firing energy weapons. The Vraxi came in perfect formation as always, because their military doctrine had been refined over thousands of years of conquest. The human fleet looked chaotic in comparison, with ships breaking formation to avoid fire and regrouping in patterns that made no sense to traditional military thinking. But chaos was something humans understood better than most species. They had learned to fight without perfect coordination and to adapt when plans fell apart. Chris Palmer commanded the defensive perimeter and coordinated the human ships with precision, born from fighting together through impossible odds. He sent fast attack craft to harass the Vraxi flanks, while heavier ships concentrated fire on targets of opportunity. Danny Cooper kept the Indomitable running far beyond its design specifications, and the ship groaned and shook, but held together through sheer determination. Kate Williams led her fighters through crossfire that would have made any sane pilot turn back. They dove between capital ships and targeted weak points with a precision that came from months of desperate combat. Sophie Grant monitored all communications during the battle, and she searched for any weakness in the Vraxi formation. She found it in a moment of confusion when Empress Shelvara's flagship turned to avoid a damaged vessel and exposed its flank to concentrated fire. Sophie called it out immediately, and Jake did not hesitate. He ordered every human ship to focus all weapons on the Empress. Everything they had. Every missile, every energy beam, every experimental weapon that scientists had warned might not work correctly. The combined firepower of the entire human fleet converged on a single target. The flagship's shields flared and held for almost 10 seconds. Then they collapsed. Kinetic rounds punched through armor plating. Missiles detonated against the hull. Energy weapons cut through vital systems. Empress Shelvara died aboard her command ship, still unable to comprehend how these young, weak humans had defeated an empire that had stood for millennia. Her last thoughts were of rage and disbelief, because this was not how the universe was supposed to work. The strong ruled the weak. That was the eternal law. But somehow these humans had broken that law through methods she could not understand. With their empress dead, the Vraxi fleet lost its coordination. Some ships tried to continue the fight. Others attempted to retreat. A few simply stopped moving as their crews struggled to process what had happened. The human fleet pressed their advantage and destroyed or disabled another 30 Vraxi vessels before the remainder managed to escape to faster-than-light speed. The Battle of Earth's threshold lasted 14 hours, and when it ended, the space around Earth was filled with debris from both sides. Humanity had lost 40% of its fleet, but Earth still stood. The homeworld was safe. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and looked at the casualty reports with hollow eyes. 3,712 humans had died in the battle. Each one had a name and a family and dreams for the future. They had died so that billions on Earth could live. Chris Palmer came to stand beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say. They had won the greatest victory in human history and paid for it with blood that could never be repaid. The news of the Empress's death spread across the Dominion faster than light itself. Subject species who had been secretly planning rebellion suddenly moved into open warfare. The Vraxi military tried to respond, but without their Empress to provide unified command, the Empire began to fracture. Different Vraxi commanders made contradictory decisions. Some tried to crush rebellions. Others withdrew to defend core worlds. A few even attempted to negotiate with the species under their control, but found that no one trusted them anymore. Sophie Grant tracked the collapse of the Dominion through intercepted communications, and she brought reports to Jake several times each day. The Kryn had liberated 3 of their worlds and were moving to free 2 more. The Helion had destroyed the Vraxi garrison on their homeworld and executed the alien administrators who had ruled them for centuries. The Corps had captured a Vraxi dreadnought and were using it to attack military outposts throughout their region. Everywhere the old order was falling apart and new possibilities were emerging. Jake called a meeting with human leadership and presented them with a choice. Humanity could try to claim the Dominion for itself. They had proven they could defeat the Vraxi, and other species might accept human rule, especially if it was gentler than what came before. Or humanity could help create something new. A free association of independent species working together by choice rather than conquest. The debate lasted for hours with valid arguments on both sides. Some pointed out that humans had paid for this territory with their blood and deserved to rule it. Others argued that becoming conquerors would make humanity no better than the Vraxi they had just defeated. In the end, they voted to support independence for all species in the former Dominion. Humanity would not try to build an empire. They would help establish a framework for cooperation and trade and mutual defense, but each species would govern itself. The decision was not unanimous, but it was the choice they made. Jake sent messages to all the rebellion leaders offering human assistance with reconstruction and defense, but making clear that humanity did not seek to rule them. The response was overwhelming gratitude mixed with suspicion, because freedom was so new to most of these species that they could barely believe it was real. Chris Palmer asked Jake if he thought they had made the right decision. Jake said he did not know if it was right, but it felt human. They had not crossed into the Dominion to become tyrants. They had come seeking a better future, and that future had to include freedom for everyone, not just for themselves. Danny Cooper said it sounded nice but probably would not work, because keeping dozens of independent species cooperating would be nearly impossible. Kate Williams replied that doing the impossible seemed to be what humans were best at. The weeks after the battle were filled with complex negotiations, as species throughout the former Dominion tried to establish new governments and new relationships. 3 years had passed since the Aurora first crossed into Vraxi territory, and Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of a space station that marked the former boundary of the Dominion. The territory had been reorganized into what was now called the Free Association, with each member species maintaining sovereignty while cooperating on matters of trade and defense. It was not perfect, and there were still conflicts that required mediation, but it was infinitely better than the empire of fear that had existed before. Jake watched ships from a dozen different species moving through the station, and he felt something that might have been satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. Sophie Grant joined him at the viewing window and told him the Kryn wanted to name their new capital city after Ryan Hughes. The Helion were proposing a memorial for everyone who had died in the resistance against the Vraxi. Several other species had similar plans to honor the humans and aliens who had fought for freedom. Sophie asked if Jake would attend the dedication ceremonies, and he said he would try, though the thought of more speeches and formal events made him tired. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a hero. He had just wanted humanity to have a chance at a better future. Chris Palmer approached from the other side of the observation deck, looking older now and carrying the weight of 3 years of constant vigilance. The Council of Species that governed the Free Association was asking if Jake would stay on as coordinator of the combined defense fleet. They trusted him and trusted humanity because humans had proven they meant what they said. When they promised not to build an empire, they had kept that promise even when it would have been easy to seize power. Chris said the offer was a good one and would give humanity significant influence in the region without requiring them to govern anyone. Jake nodded slowly and said the council should not trust humanity too much because humans were still learning how to be responsible, members of a galactic community. They had made mistakes during the reconstruction and would make more in the future. But yes, he would accept the position because someone needed to coordinate defense, and it might as well be someone who understood the cost of war. Chris smiled and said that was probably the most honest answer anyone had ever given to a diplomatic offer. Kate Williams arrived with a report from long-range sensors. There was unexplored space beyond the former Dominion that stretched for thousands of light years with no major powers claiming it. The region contained hundreds of potentially habitable worlds and resources that would take centuries to fully catalog. Several species in the Free Association were already planning joint exploration missions. Kate asked if humanity would participate, and Jake said of course they would because exploration was in human nature. They had crossed into the Dominion, not just for territory, but because humans needed to see what was over the next horizon. Danny Cooper's voice came through the communication system saying they were getting unusual readings from the deep space sensors. There were structures out there in the unexplored region. Artificial structures on a scale that made even the Vraxi world breakers look small. Whatever built them had technology far beyond anything humanity or the former Dominion species possessed. Danny said the structures appeared abandoned, but that was just speculation based on the fact they were not transmitting any signals. He asked if they should send a probe to investigate. Jake considered the question carefully. Humanity had learned over the past 3 years that the galaxy was full of surprises, both wonderful and terrible. Ancient structures could contain knowledge or they could contain dangers best left alone. But humans had never been good at leaving mysteries unsolved. He told Danny to prepare an exploration mission, but to include representatives from multiple species. Whatever they found out there would affect everyone in the Free Association, not just humanity. They should face it together. Sophie worked on organizing the exploration mission and reached out to potential participants from various species. The response was enthusiastic, with volunteers from almost every member of the Free Association. Everyone wanted to be part of discovering what lay beyond their known space. It reminded Jake of the early days after the Aurora's first crossing, when everything had seemed possible despite the dangers. That sense of potential had driven humanity to take impossible risks and somehow survive them. Maybe it could drive the Free Association to achieve things none of them could accomplish alone. Chris helped coordinate the defensive arrangements for the home systems while the exploration fleet was being assembled. They could not send too many ships on the mission, because the Free Association still needed to maintain security against potential threats. Some former Vraxi commanders had disappeared into the outer reaches of their former territory, and no one knew what they were planning. There were also pirates and opportunists who saw the transition period as a chance to seize what they could. The galaxy had not suddenly become peaceful just because one empire had fallen. Kate trained the pilots who would escort the exploration fleet. Most were young and had never seen combat, which she considered a good thing. They had grown up during the war years but would hopefully live most of their lives in peace. She taught them not just how to fly and fight, but when not to fight. Sometimes the bravest thing was to retreat and preserve lives for another day. Sometimes victory meant finding a solution that avoided combat entirely. These were lessons humanity had learned the hard way. Danny finalized preparations on the ships that would make the journey. They were equipped with the best sensors and defensive systems the Free Association could provide, along with enough supplies for a 2-year mission. The exploration fleet was not designed to conquer or colonize. It existed purely to gather information and establish first contact with whatever they might find. If the ancient structures proved dangerous, they would report back and let wiser minds decide how to proceed. If they found something wonderful, they would share it with everyone in the Free Association. Jake attended the departure ceremony and gave a short speech that he had written himself, rather than letting diplomatic staff compose. Something formal. He told the assembled crew that they were about to cross another boundary, just as the Aurora had done years ago. This time they would not do it alone, and this time they were not fleeing from anyone or fighting for survival. They were going as explorers representing multiple species working together. Whatever they found would belong to all of them. Whatever challenges they faced would be faced together. That was the future humanity had fought for, and that was what made all the sacrifices worthwhile. The exploration fleet departed on schedule with ships from 7 different species, traveling together into unknown space. Sophie went with them because her skills at decoding alien systems might prove invaluable if they encountered technology from whatever civilization had built the mysterious structures. Kate commanded the fighter escort because even peaceful exploration required protection. Danny stayed behind to coordinate support operations and maintain communication with the fleet as long as they remained in range. Jake and Chris watched the ships disappear into faster-than-light speed. They stood in silence for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened since that first crossing years ago. Humanity had gone from desperate newcomers to respected members of an interstellar community. They had fought a war that should have destroyed them and somehow emerged victorious. They had helped tear down an empire and build something better in its place. Now they were heading into the unknown again because that was what humans did. Chris asked if Jake ever regretted crossing into the Dominion. Jake thought about the question seriously before answering. He regretted every death that had occurred because of decisions he made. He regretted that so many people had paid the ultimate price for humanity's ambitions. But he did not regret standing up to the Vraxi or refusing to bow to their threats. Humanity had needed to prove they deserved a place in the galaxy, and they had done that through courage and determination. The cost had been terrible, but the alternative would have been slow extinction. As humanity was gradually pushed into smaller and smaller corners of space, messages started coming in from the exploration fleet as they made their way toward the mysterious structures. The transmissions took hours to arrive due to the vast distances involved. Sophie reported that the structures were even larger up close than sensors had indicated. They appeared to be some kind of ring system surrounding an entire star. Danny calculated that building something on that scale would require resources equivalent to dismantling several planets. Whatever species had constructed it possessed capabilities far beyond anything in the current galaxy. Kate sent tactical reports noting that the structures showed no signs of active weapons or defense systems. The exploration fleet was approaching cautiously, but so far had encountered no resistance. They were beginning detailed scans and preparing to send boarding parties to investigate the interior of one of the rings. Sophie theorized the structures might be some kind of energy collection system designed to harness power directly from the star. If they could understand how it worked, the technology could revolutionize energy production for everyone in the Free Association. The next transmission arrived 18 hours later, and Sophie's voice carried B.